In a recent article in the Hill, a psychiatrist argued for a return to the era of asylums through a process called the clinical necessity standard. So, what is that standard, and why is it a terrible, terrible idea? One of the foundational elements of this psychiatrist's argument is his denouncement of a federal precedent created by a case called O'Connor versus Donaldson. And I think we need to break down why he is both wrong about how to interpret that case and wrong that this is the only place where standards and due process were established.
Anyone who is against due process rights and civil protections, that really tells you everything you need to know about that individual. But putting that aside, right, this is just factually wrong. This dude does not know what he's talking about. If we want to understand the dangerousness standard that he's so concerned about, we really have to go back further than O'Connor versus Donaldson and understand that there was really a revolution in law that was happening in the late 60s and the early 1970s that was, is called the due process revolution. And a central case in that, which I feel doesn't get the attention that it deserves, is Lessard versus Schmidt, right? And that is such an important case that was brought in the early 1970s, before O'Connor versus Donaldson, that really did show the extreme dangers and potentials for abuse, right, in a standard that is based largely on clinical necessity or what the state thinks is best for you. Right, it's this principle that there's this benevolent state who's going to be acting in the best interests of its citizens. And Alberta Lessard was an eccentric school teacher who was not a danger to anyone. And under these laws, they wanted to lock her up for life, and she would not stand for that. She fought back. She won in Lessard versus Schmidt, and the Lessard decision really established that people who face civil commitment have the right to the same due process protections as people who are facing jail and prison time, right? That was the really important outcome of Lessard versus Schmidt, that for the first time, people had the right to adversarial legal representation to fight for their rights. And that's what authoritarian psychiatrists like this dude want to get rid of. So, pointing to a law to justify your argument is lazy. Any of us can do a little research and see how, the law is being invoked here for really propagandistic purposes.
Well, I think if we extend that a little bit, the idea that O'Connor versus Donaldson, which I believe was 1975, was not the first establishment of due process. Lessard was 72 or 73. And even before that, like the era of quote unquote deinstitutionalization that's being denounced here started occurring in the 60s. Like JFK started talking about it, and he was killed in what, 62. So obviously it was happening long before O'Connor versus Donaldson. And if we really break down what is being romanticized here, it's an era of forced sterilization. It's an era where homosexuality was a mental illness. It's an era where there were forced medical experimentations. People were warehoused in places where they were either starved or fed in a way that caused them to choke to death. Like the horrors that were happening were systemic. It wasn't one bad facility. It was a systemic overcrowding with lack of actual care. And so what started happening with the due process revolution was the establishment that if you are going to use a process that detains someone, you need to treat them as a person. You need to afford them the same basic rights that everyone else gets. And a lot of states saw what it would cost to actually treat people as human and said, ooh, that seems expensive. And the promise that was supposed to come with that was the enrichment of the community supports, that the funding that was being taken away from state facilities would go into the community. That never really happened. So there's this whole mess of things that's happened over the past several decades where the prison industrial complex has skyrocketed. Housing has become inaccessible. We have wars, we have political upheaval. Like you have all of these various factors that have led to a moment where there is a housing crisis and there's an alarming number of people who don't have access to safe housing, and there's an alarming number of people being increasingly diagnosed, and civil commitments having continued to rise for decades. All of those things are happening. And then people like the author of this opinion piece in the Hill try to boil all of that down to say deinstitutionalization. We afforded some people rights, and that created all of these problems.
I think also something that really disturbs me about this article is the false dichotomy that is always in these kinds of think pieces, if you can call them that. It's that either, we have this quote negligent system, right? And I will agree that the system does neglect a lot of people, but it also overtreats a whole lot of people, right? So you have this like forced neglect thing going on. But you can't argue that it is purely negligent, right? I think that that is completely just it's hyperbole and it's wrong. And so replacing that right with a new model based solely on quote clinical necessity with minimal, if any, judicial interference. So it's right, we just kind of want to throw out these civil rights laws and replace them with clinical judgment. And it's frankly ridiculous, right? Because the current system absolutely involves clinical judgment, right? You have to have at least one physician, and in many cases two, have to certify that need for commitment, right? And we know that even now, judges so often defer to clinicians. We literally sat in on a case, on a hearing a couple months ago, where we just saw the judge say, oh, this is what clinician says, fine, we're going to go on this. So the due process safeguard is the only thing that we have to prevent wrongful confinement and detention, that could be renewed indefinitely, right? Solely on a doctor's say so and a judge's deference, right? And so if we look at the actual model that this dude is proposing in this Haill article, um, correct me if I get this wrong. I thought he mentioned two professionals' judgment with clear accountability. I don't know what clear accountability would look like. It's undefined. But that really would serve to drastically erode what legal rights and civil rights protections exist.
Yeah, and I appreciate highlighting what is the proposed sort of process from this piece, which is that two licensed mental health professionals with independent judgment and clear accountability would assess a person and decide whether or not a forced detention is appropriate. And the thing that to like just really break down about that is, first of all, clear accountability does not exist currently. So I don't know where it's coming from or what it looks like in this person's head. Independent judgment is also highly suspect because often you have people who are like, if I make the wrong decision, clinicians, if I make the wrong decision, I lose my job. If I make the wrong decision, maybe I get sued. And so there are all these external pressures, lobbying groups, like really pressuring people on social media or through lobbying efforts to make a certain type of decision, telling clinicians, you have to use court orders or else you're going to kill people. Not evidence-based, but clinicians all the time experience pressure from various places. So this idea of independent judgment assumes that every clinician has the ability, or within whatever context they're in, to challenge their supervisor, to challenge the county pressure, to challenge the lobbying pressure, which is something that we should not assume is in place. So what this person is saying is let's trust those people by telling them, don't worry about the law. Just make whatever judgment you feel is right. And we're going to go with that. We're going to tell the courts they can't intervene with your vibes, with your opinion. So you have a group of people, clinicians broadly speaking, who are not expected to be thoroughly trained on every aspect of mental health law. They're expecting that there's a process that will check them if they're wrong, which of course many clinicians get frustrated by, But there is supposed to be that process so that clinicians don't have to spend a bunch of time learning the law, although they still should anyway. And this person is saying, what if we just got rid of all of that and we just said no law, all vibes, whatever you feel is right, go for it. And then I'm sure someone 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the road will have a review. And I think the other element is this is not isolated. This is one of a series of articles arguing that compassion is detention, that civil commitments are the only compassionate approach.
And I just wrote an article about this, about the ways that forced treatment is dressed up with all of these pretty words. So compassion is one we hear all the time. And in fact, Alberta's involuntary drug treatment law, I think, is called the Compassionate Intervention Act, if I've got that right. And if you really look at the word compassion from an etymological standpoint, it involves actual empathy. It involves literally being with someone, putting yourself in their shoes, right? It involves a level of empathy that is central and inherent to the original definition of compassion, right? And it is so clear from the way that this author talks about the people that he would like to take rights away from if he had his say. The way he talks about them is so universally dehumanizing, right? It veers between pity and disgust, right? There's no compassion there. So it's again just this repetition over and over again of a word, of a concept. You know, if we say this harmful policy is compassionate, if we say it enough, people will believe it, right? And I think that is one of the most disturbing aspects to me, is that it is this very much law and order approach that is wearing sheep's clothing and is marketed and sold, right, as progress and as reform, where it is so clearly the opposite. It is regressive. It would literally take us backwards to norms that literally are the stuff of horror movies, right? We might argue that the Victorian asylum, genre is gratuitous and exploitative. But there is a reason that there's these horrors that keep being repeated in our public consciousness about that era. There's a reason that it is so frightening. It is based in the realities that are not limited to that era, but continue, right? For people to think that, oh, that the kinds of violations that happened in the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest are a thing of the past. These kinds of violations, human rights abuses, continue to happen in institutional settings, right? So he argues that not only are these things exaggeration, that they don't happen anymore, right? And that is all patently false, right? So I think that there's so much misinformation. It's hard to know where to start and where to end with this, but I do think, right, that the use of words like compassion and recovery to kind of sell these things to the public, we have to call it out at every opportunity, and show how they are manipulating us to accept erosion of due process, erosion of civil rights, and trust. It doesn't stop with folks who have these diagnoses. We are seeing the erosion of due process all throughout our society.
And I imagine that most people who have been through this sort of process could identify with the situation where if you don't comply, if you resist, if you debate semantics when you're in a facility or in a psych ward, that can often lead to more restrictive, more forceful acts by the people surrounding you. I know I experienced that. I know, like, I was being confined to a wheelchair as part of treatment. And then when I went to my commitment hearing, I was wheeled to a different floor in the hospital with the psychiatrist who's like over 6 feet, just sort of towering over me. And like I'm like wheeled into this little office space where a psychiatrist stands over me and is like, this guy, he definitely needs a commitment. And so that was not a meaningful sort of judicial check, I felt. But even that sort of minimal oversight is too far for the author of this piece. The fact that that psychiatrist had to confine me and wheel me in front of a judge, it's too much. And when I resisted and when I debated semantics, the response was, do you want to be confined to a different type of chair? Do you want to be confined to a chair that doesn't move, where you're going to stay for as long as we say you need to stay there? And so, I mean, for anyone watching, I would just encourage people to think, who is it that we need to hear from about what's actually happening with this process and about what the people going through this process need? We need to talk to those people. We need to listen to them. And inherent in these arguments is the idea that if you are pushed into this process, you're inherently someone who shouldn't be listened to. We all need to challenge that, and we all need to ask that question of, what if it was you? What if it was you that was desperate and alone and scared in some sort of sparse, unsafe facility, and a clinician has the absolute authority to detain you for as long as they feel? What would you want the courts to do then?
I think you're pointing to one of the most frightening aspects of all of this is that once you have a certain diagnosis, you are no longer considered to be a reliable narrator. And in fact, right, as you said, any way you try to defend yourself can and will be used against you in this situation, and is used as further evidence of your unfitness to advocate for yourself. And so, exactly as you said, without any kind of legal advocacy in such a situation, it is the stuff of horror movies, right? I mean, anyone who puts themselves in the shoes of someone in that situation where anything you say is then seen as further evidence of your insanity, right? And there is no way out of that other than through the very imperfect levers of the law, right? Until we abolish this entire system, unfortunately, it's either keeping people from getting caught up in these systems, but once they are, there needs to be solid legal advocacy. And so rarely is that even in place.